Alright, so before I get started on this video topic, there's four things that I want to mention. First is that this is not an advice video. This is more of a broad understanding on this particular topic. I'm not married, so I'm not in the position to be able to give advice to anybody. Two, this is not a video discussing the topic of divorce. I plan on making one discussing the topic at some point, but at the moment, that's not what this video is about. And then three, I'm defining young marriage as a legal marriage in America. This is not a video discussing the topic of child marriage, which I strongly condemn and oppose, but that's not what this video is about. And then four, going further defining young marriage here, I'm assuming that both partners are young. This is not going to be like an age gap situation where one partner is young or something like that. So anyways, so this topic sparked my interest because I saw a post on Twitter about someone who was posting about I believe their son getting married at like 20 years old or something like that, and it was of course a war in the comment section, because you can say anything on Twitter and it's a war in the comment section. But I do kind of want to I do think that there is an important discussion here, because I think that obviously a lot of conservatives like to promote the idea of young marriage. I think oftentimes they might do so a little bit too hastily and very, very dangerously. So as a conservative Christian myself, I want to, I think, try to illuminate more of the reasonable perspective, hopefully. But anyways, so let's get started here. So first of all, the average age of a first marriage is 27 for men, 25 for women. Let me switch this to red here. So you could define young marriage as anything below that, but I'm going to probably be assuming like below the age of 22, which should be like pre-college graduation, for the most part for a lot of people. So kind of somewhere in that range, though. Of course, some people might define young marriage a little bit more differently than I do, but that's how I'm kind of sort of defining it. So like, yeah, basically 22 and under. So obviously there's a lot of controversies with this. So the first one is this whole idea of immaturity, and I think there is quite a bit of stuff to do this. So first is there could be a stage of life sort of situation going on here. For example, an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old, which would be pre-college, post-college on average. There's going to be a significant difference. A lot of 18-year-olds may have never even had a job. They might not have a car, something like that. Well, if you're 22, you're at least getting into the point where you're going to be stepping into full-time job sort of situation. You're going to have a lot more of your life under your control, be a little bit more independent at that point versus 18. I think that's very, very relevant for this particular issue, because I think that this sort of stuff actually does end up mattering in a lot of cases for determining whether someone would actually be able to succeed in a marriage or not. And yeah, so obviously like being in college versus being in the workforce, big difference sort of there. How financially stable are you? How emotionally stable are you? Are you being overworked in college? Are you being overworked in work? Something like that. And also even like a living space situation might be something to consider as well. Do you have experience living in your own place, your own apartment, being able to pay those bills, be familiar with that particular process? I think that that's a good thing that people should at least know somewhat about before just jumping into a marriage with absolutely no idea. I think that's a very good idea. Like, I know somebody who is choosing to seek out, spend like a good chunk of time. It doesn't necessarily be a lot, but like a few months in their own apartment prior to moving forward with their intended marriage, so that they'd actually be practicing that particular way of life and understand how all of that works. Now, of course, a big part of this is also the whole science behind brain development. So 25 and 22, these are the average ages for men and women respectively, for how long it takes their brain to develop. And of course, this is important because if, say, you are a 20 and 20-year-old couple, then in that situation, on average, both of your brains are not going to be fully developed. Could you be considered responsible enough or mature enough to be able to make a decision such as getting married? I think that, personally, I'm not a huge fan of this argument. I do think that this does note that it is going to be different for everybody. Obviously, these are averages. They don't speak for everybody. Plus, if this is what you want to argue, would then we have to raise the age for possibly consuming alcohol if we have to be this specific age in order to make decisions such that they could affect it. And the same thing is with voting. If this is what the brain development age is, does that mean that we should raise the age of voting in order to make sure that people are fully developed to make decisions? I think the point I'm trying to make here is that I think this is something to consider, but at the end of the day, like, I don't think that you necessarily have to have your brain fully developed to make major life decisions, which is, of course, why I think that 18 for being a legal adult makes sense in a lot of situations. 21 to drink, that makes sense. 25 to rent a car or something like that. I think that one might be a little bit too high. But nonetheless, I think that I don't really hold too much weight to this particular argument for those reasons. Like, how does this affect other different parts of life, such as drinking or voting? But I think that it is still a little bit relevant to discuss. And of course, another thing that people will often point out is that young couples tend to have an increased divorce rate. This could be for a variety of reasons, such as the immaturity thing, and of course, now I think in a culture, our perception of divorce has kind of gotten warped to the point where divorce isn't necessarily even looked down upon, because of how frequent it is, how common it is, which is quite unfortunate. And I do want to make a video discussing that particular problem. Of course, like, what is a 21-year-old like me be able to discuss about that? I don't really know, but I do think that it is a necessary discussion to have, especially for the young generation, to see if we'll be able to overcome these mistakes from the past in some of these different areas. But that is an interesting thing to discuss, and there could be a multitude of reasons. I didn't research too closely into what that could be. I think that the immaturity part could play a big role, but I also think that the next topic, which is going to be religion, could also play a role. Obviously, I'm a Christian, so I have seen a lot of this right in front of my face going on. So religion, obviously Christianity, pretty much all religions do strongly promote marriage, and by extension, they also will oftentimes promote young marriage. And yeah, so obviously they'll promotion of marriage is a very, very common thing in the church. They also tend to ignore singles. There's a lot of people on the internet who've had testimonies of effectively feeling like a lower class individual within the church, which is unfortunate. That's not really my experience, but there are certainly people that do feel that way, and I think the church could do a little bit better at uplifting singles, I guess you could say. Not necessarily looking down on them. Of course, in extreme cases, some people outright shun singles. There was the one viral clip of the pastor that was effectively bashing single men for being lazy. I think that's could be part of the situation, but that's certainly not all of it. And of course, when you have this sort of setup within the church, this could lead to some type of a coercion to get married. Everyone around you married, they all seem happy. They all seem happy. They're happy. So the coercion thing is just a little bit it's a little bit tricky. And of course, there's a few different people. Gosh, what was I going to talk about with this part? I reviewed the notes, but I didn't review this part. I think the idea I had here is these are the kind of the different views of this whole religious. Yeah, that's right. This is like the idea of like what a skeptic would look at this. The skeptic is probably just going to say that this is just a form of indoctrination, religious indoctrination, and so they're just going to outright oppose it in general. The feminist, of course, both the feminist and the red pill have sex within them. Probably even the majority at this point for both of them generally condemn marriage in a lot of different ways for different reasons. The feminist will see marriage as like a sort of like a unnecessary bondage on them, giving like selling your soul to their husband or whatever. Of course, not all feminists necessarily think that. It's more going to be your radical modern feminists, which is I would barely even consider feminism at this point, and of course the red pill as well. I do not like the red pill, and I do want to make a video discussing why, but the red pill, I think, is basically the literal opposite side of the same coin as the radical feminists. They're just from the man's perspective, and I think that they have a lot of legitimate concerns, such as divorce court, men getting screwed over in divorce court, all that stuff, all that jazz, the modern woman, which is a thing, though may not necessarily be as common as the red pill thinks. But I think both of these groups have a very poor view of marriage, probably possibly from what they've seen in the world or from those around them. But overall, I think generally both of these ideologies are ones that should basically just be ignored for Christians in a lot of sense. I really don't know what I was thinking right here. I'm recording this video like a few days after I wrote this outline, but anyways, so my thoughts. This is already 10 minutes. That's interesting. Okay. So first of all, I think first and foremost, there needs to be some sort of balance within this particular issue. How does that look? It's a little bit difficult. So obviously in the church, you'll have this sort of coercion, this sort of rhetoric up here of, oh yeah, you should get married, marriage good. And young people could see that and end up entering into a marriage that a little bit too quickly, too early. And of course, in some cases it might work, but in other cases it also doesn't work. And so we need to be, I think, a little bit careful with the rhetoric. And I think a good way to do that is to be more open to singles, allowing singles to thrive within the church, feel comfortable within the church, not be forced into the relationships. I think that could be a good first step. And I also think that just maybe try to acknowledge that there are things that you should consider prior to getting into a marriage, even at any age, but especially when you're young. I kind of wrote out this idea where I think there might be different rhetoric that one would use for the whole congregation versus like an individual case where maybe for the whole congregation you'd say you'd be a little bit more hesitant to promote young marriage, but in an individual case maybe you have two different 20 and 20-year-old couples. One of them seems a lot more mature, a lot more ready than the other. You could maybe then use different rhetoric or support them in their individual directions. I think in like individual, some cases they get concerned is like longevity. One thing that I've noticed is that that is often ignored by skeptics of the young marriage perspective. Is they think that they're rushing into it, but in reality, some of these couples have been dating for like 4+, 5+ years. Prior to getting married, of course, during their time in high school. And in that particular situation, I think that longevity at least would make me more likely to support that young marriage versus like a couple that met in college and is trying to get married in 8 months. I think that there's quite a bit of a difference in the maturity and readiness in that particular instance. This is one that the church doesn't want to talk about, the money factor. Obviously, I don't think that one necessarily has to be financially stable to pursue a marriage, but I think that it's a good thing to at least have like the groundwork, and to the point where you're able to live independently without much struggle at all. All right, and then I think this is the last part of this, is I do want to briefly discuss this idea of sex and religion. There's this kind of idea that you'll see very frequently whenever a young religious individual gets married young, is there's this whole idea that they're getting married just for sex. This sort of idea, because the church obviously fairly famously restricts sex until marriage, even though statistically it seems that a lot of Christians aren't actually doing that. But if you restrict sex, then that's going to cause encouragement to actually marry for that particular purpose. And this does absolutely happen. And I think this does lead to instability. And the tricky part is that like most of the time people aren't going to admit that's what they're actually doing. And oftentimes it could only be one partner, and I think that's where the instability is going to really come in. If one partner has this on their mind, the other one has genuine reasons to pursue a marriage, that's going to lead to instability. But it's obviously it's a very tricky issue because it absolutely does happen, but I don't think it definitely doesn't always happen. There's many cases where it certainly does work out. Like every time someone mentions a young marriage, yeah, the comments will be a war, but there's always going to be like every single person who got married young ever also commenting on that post, supporting it. And I think that this whole view that people are marrying just for sex is, first of all, has little faith in humanity. I mean, I get it. Human condition, we're sinful. I understand this. Okay, to a certain extent, I understand this. I also think that a lot of people do underestimate the Christian will um, to be free from the things of the world. Of course, again, human condition, there's only so far that you can free yourself from sinful desires and things like that. But I do think that the world is so separate from the Christian subculture that that like the idea that people would actually be able to save themselves from marriage and not have that be a motivational factor just is absurd. Of course, I'm not necessarily saying like you can't have this motivational factor, but obviously, if that's your only one or even your primary one, I think that that's probably not exactly a good look for you or for your future. So anyways, the third argument, this is kind of the argument for it, this whole idea of building your life together. Life is hard, so it's good to do it with a companion. And I would say that this is kind of the main appeal of the long-term relationship, not even necessarily a marriage, but this whole idea of having a companion to do life with, to build up your life together. I think that this is a pretty good argument for it. I think there is something about being with somebody while you like your life goes upward, versus if you get upward and then try to like throw somebody in, like just throw somebody into your life, then that I think that that could be end up being a pretty big issue. So anyways, that's kind of my thoughts. Went a little bit longer than I wanted to. That's perfectly fine though. But anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.